The initial task, and probably the most important task, was designing the car and how it feels in the game. To achieve this, I began by using Epic Games' Chaos Vehicle Overview video, which goes into detail about the functionality and the statistics of the car, and how changing them will alter how the car feels. After this process, I began researching Need for Speed. This was one of our targets for the ceiling of gameplay. During the testing process of our own car, I had Need for Speed running at the same time, and I was switching between the two apps, just trying to see how our car feels in comparison. We now have a car that feels quite similar, and I'm quite happy with the results thus far. The next challenge will be to see how it handles other scenarios such as going over jumps over ramps or going off-road. After the completion of the player's car, the next task was to work on the AI cars. These would be used for populating our levels. Firstly, the cars need a way to travel along the roads. The dark blue lines known as splines will govern their movement. When the car reaches the end, they will find the next nearest spline and begin using that one. As in the real world, we want the cars to respond to traffic lights. Otherwise, when more cars are present, it will cause congestion and make it difficult for our player to navigate. The final part of the AI series thus far is the police car. This is an important aspect of the game flow, as police cars will try to hunt the player down. The user interface is an indication the player is being chased. The idea is to add a level of tension so the player feels desperate to get to safety. After the cars have been further refined, I will begin on making cars for races. Following feedback we received from GDLX by the public, it was crucial to start working on solutions to these problems. The first issue was to try and stop the player from getting lost. In our current level, we had beacons that the player had to reach to progress. If a beacon was off screen, the player wouldn't know where to go. To rectify this, I've implemented a mini-map which also contains the current beacon's position and the distance between that beacon and the player. The foundations are set up for future levels as well. The next issue wasn't a massive one, but the dialogue needed to flow better as it could kind of be interrupted by different game events. We tried to create one ourselves, and we found a plugin that was easy to implement and suit our needs. It also allowed easy editing for future dialogue sessions. The current dialogue that you see is currently a placeholder just for this mission. The main feedback we received from our initial demo was how the car handles and its drifting functionality. The main issue was that the drift doesn't push the car around properly and it doesn't really feel like it's doing much. After tweaking the handling and finalising the drift, the next stage was to alter the suspension, as currently our car was bouncing a bit too much when going off ramps. After that, we decided we wanted to give the player some air control. This means that once the player has gone up a ramp, it will allow them to manoeuvre the car so they can position where it will land. And this is quite beneficial, especially if the player makes a mistake. Finally, we decided to include some visual enhancements to better the whole experience of the driving process. Following the last event where we showcased the game, we had a discussion within the team on how we wanted to guide the player to these objectives that we made. It became clear that a lot of players were getting lost within the inner city and they needed more guidance on how to reach these beacons. We first changed their position to make them more readable to the player, but secondly we needed a way to kind of guide them to these locations as it weren't always clear. We decided to use a term called breadcrumbing, where we would place beacons closer to the player and guide them to their final objective. This made navigating the world easier. However, by the time the player has done this twice and then given the same task again, we needed it to be a bit more exciting. So to do this, we decided that the player would have a timer of the dialogue that's being played, plus an additional timer of 30 seconds to reach the final beacon. As this is still an early game and demo, we didn't want to punish the player too harshly if it didn't reach the goal. So to do this, we just changed the dialogue when the player reaches the final beacon, depending on whether they do it before or after the timer expires. Although all the models aren't finalised yet, the whole experience of just driving through the tunnel immediately after pushing start wasn't that enjoyable. We decided to turn it into a cutscene where the car will just shoot through the tunnel and then load into the first level. The next stage was making the dialogue more presentable and digestible to the viewer. We changed the location of the text on the screen and added some placeholder images to give the player better insight on who is speaking. Additionally, we added some more cutscenes as well for when the player has reached certain points in the game. These are more akin to comic book panels for now, and has dialogue over the top of it as well. Finally, the biggest overhaul has been the optimization work, which has allowed the game to run smoother and also workflow in the editor. The way to control these data layers, however, I've had to make a custom collision box area where the car will drive through to activate and deactivate certain objects within the scene. The problem that we were going to face is if the player drove through the box with the pink arrow, it would activate something, but if they reversed and they were still facing it, there's a chance that it could disappear in front of their eyes. This isn't ideal, so I made a second arrow in which the player has to turn around and drive through that way, the yellow one, to deactivate the objects within the scene. After that, I decided to do the same sort of collision box with our particles and sound in the beautiful corner that we're making, and it works in the same manner, but you have to drive through the blue one to activate stuff and drive through the orange one to deactivate, and it requires the player to actually be facing that arrow when they're driving through it. Previous month's work on optimization, various users had a lot of slowdown during the builds, especially when trying to load certain areas of the game. We decided to split these areas into even smaller chunks. That way, when the user is driving through the city and on their way to the city, they won't be loading in too much and cause less slowdown, or any slowdown at all is the idea. The next step was to optimize the shaders and materials of the world. I changed a few within on barriers and also the car and the AI cars. On this chart you can see there is a green and a red, green to red bar. Anything in the green is well optimized, anything that's red or white is kind of in the danger zone of being too costly to render during runtime. As you can see, we only have a couple of items in the red at the moment, which is still not too bad. After this, I decided to clean up some of the code within the level and the car. Not only is this to make it run more efficiently during runtime, but it also means that the rest of the team who might be looking at the project for the first time, or if we get any new people on board, they'll be able to see what I have done and how to work with what has been made already. After this, we decided to test various builds. Tested more builds with the new optimizations ready for publishers.